with the other class yesterday, I finished up on page 588 with the United States. So I'm going to start off with Canada. Essentially, what I remember about Canada, during this period of time, they remained under the control of Britain. Hey, folks, they would not join with us when we fought our revolution. Then after we got our independence, some of them tried to get their independence from Britain also, and Britain sent an army, and their army clobbered them. Essentially, they remained separate. The United States tried to take over Canada 2 times, once during the Revolutionary War and once during the War of 1812. And I have to say, folks, the British Army whipped us both times. I mean, didn't whip us in the Revolutionary War, but they whipped us when we tried to take over Canada. Make a long story short, the United States did not get to take over Canada, and Canada was to remain under the control of Britain. To a lesser extent every generation, but to some extent to this day, they're still considered part of Britain. Like the United States, Canada wound up expanding all the way from coast to coast. And Canada is on the map at least one of the biggest countries that ever has existed. But in actual reality, most of its people live in the southern part of Canada, with the northern part very, very much uninhabited, or very sparsely inhabited. Don't worry about the Canadian prime ministers. Your book names a few. Just know that Quebec presented a bit of problem because Quebec was French-speaking, and well, they had French culture. But as part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War, the Canadian government was forced to recognize the language and customs of the people of Quebec and not try to force the people of Quebec to join the Anglican Church. The people of Quebec have remained primarily Roman Catholic from that day till this. All right, so much for Canada. Looking at page 589, they use the word mass. Now, to me, that word mass sounds a whole lot like Karl Marx, who talked about the masses. There is no such thing as a mass society. There are no mass people, and there are no masses. Nevertheless, your book more or less lumps it together, talk about the mass society. And what they mean by mass society is a lot of people come together in houses. The houses were close together. In fact, oftentimes they weren't even individual houses at all. They were apartments. And people would live on top of each other or below each other or live under the same roof. And where you could hear all the noise that one family made could be heard through the thin walls of the other apartment next door. Anyway, people began living closer and closer together, and but cities changed people. Laws became more difficult to enforce. One thing they had to do, as they learned that germs cause disease, they had to build better sewage and drainage systems. Otherwise, the living conditions would have been utterly unbearable. And again, this was before the automobile, which meant a person had to move near where he got a job. Now, right now, I'm commuting 34 miles one way to get here. And at the end of the class, I'll be commuting 34 miles to get back. But I couldn't do that 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And even 20 and 30 years ago, automobiles were not as good as they are today. And cars were much more prone to break down, and if I had to change the oil every 1,000 miles, I'll be changing the oil 2 times a week. But fortunately, we don't have to do that as much today. But anyway, it's not unheard of for persons to commute 40 and 50 miles these days, but in those days, you get a job, you had to be prepared to move near your job. And it encouraged people to stay at their job longer than we do today. There wasn't as much job hopping. But people began to move from the countryside to the cities, and this movement was called urbanization. Urban is the opposite of the word rural. Rural means countryside, urban means city. We became more and more city dwellers. The book talks about how the plumbing improved and hot baths became available to more and more people because they learned how to heat water. They also learned more about cleaning water. There was a time, folks, when everybody would go to this well, and if they wanted to drink, they'd pump water from the well, and everybody drank from the same drinking cup. Well, one day, people were getting sick, and a doctor finally figured out what's causing their sickness, so the people went to this well and found the pump handle removed. The doctor said, nobody drinks from this well until I deem the water is safe. People had to go find another alternate means of getting drinking water. The common drinking cup eventually went out of circulation because it was learned that common drinking cups were guaranteed to help spread disease from one person to another. And cities learned how to give the people who lived in cleaner water, they're called city water as opposed to well water. Now, some of you might not, well, yeah, well, you still see signs that say well water. Go to a park and you'll say this park is watered by well water, which means that they drilled down and got water from a well underneath the park rather than use city water, which might eventually run out. But by so doing, they claim that they're saving money. Or you go to a car wash and they'll say we're using recycled water. Otherwise, car washes would take up a whole lot of water that otherwise might run our lakes dry eventually. But they'll take the water from the car wash and recycle it and run it through. Again, you'll be seeing these signs if you go to any of these places. The book talks about how a lot of times the richer people would join their families by marriage alliances. The son of this wealthy person might marry the daughter of that wealthy person so that their estates would be joined. And this was something that the nobility in Europe had been doing for 1,000 years, and maybe even longer. There came to be a middle class, actually an upper middle class and a lower middle class. The lower middle class would consist of bookkeepers, bank tellers, salespeople, telephone operators, secretaries, positions like this. People who were considered highly skilled persons, but nevertheless were not rich. They'd be the middle. Of course, the upper classes were generally the wealthier, the persons at the top. And blue-collar workers would be the lower classes, with a class in the middle of class of semi-skilled or sometimes highly skilled workers. In the case of women, one thing I want to emphasize was that there were a lot fewer babies born per woman, even though now it may sound like I'm saying the population decreased. No, the population did not decrease, owing to the fact that a higher percentage of these babies grew up and survived. And part of that was due to better health, better sanitation, the vaccination against smallpox. So women could have fewer babies and still have the case of population increase. They practiced a lot of birth control, and this became a real strong issue. Some churches said birth control was immoral or wrong. Others said it was okay. Again, each of you can make up your mind for yourself. The women became more and more accustomed to working outside the home, and as they did so, they began to demand the right to women's suffrage or demand the right to vote. Up until this time, no country in Europe or in America had given women the right to vote. But eventually, the first European country to give women the right to vote was Norway. Scandinavian country, and then some Latin American countries did the same thing. In the United States, the western states were the first to give women the right to vote. Wyoming was the first state. Don't worry about that so much, but if you study American history, you'll learn that Wyoming gave the women the right to vote before it was put in the United States Constitution. What really helped the cause of women, though, was World War I. During World War I, when most of the young men and able-bodied men were out in the battlefields, women were left behind to operate the trucks, the taxis, the factories, and it was, I mean, you go to a typical factory during the war years in Europe, and you'd have found the factory operated by old men, sometimes really old men or women. They were hiring women, and the women's logic was, if we can do the work that men normally do, then we should be allowed to vote also. And their cries to vote were heeded. After World War I, most of the nations of the world that had democracy gave women the right to vote, including the United States. World War I ended in 1918. In 1920, the women of America voted for the first time. I mean, well, all the women were allowed to vote throughout the entire United States. Like I say, Wyoming had given the women the right to vote in the 1890s. So some states had already granted it, but it was the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, gave women the right to vote in the United States.